Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And I do hope you had a fantastic weekend. I was just, boy, I was so thrilled. I actually made some progress on two of my cars over the weekend. I made a little bitty teensy bit of progress on my 69 Mach 1. I made a little bit more significant progress on my 69 Ford Fairlane Sport Coupe. So, anytime you can actually make progress when you're working on an old car, that's pretty good because invariably, and especially like on the Fairlane, I'm modernizing some of the things. And so when you start putting newer stuff on older cars, you run into all sorts of complications and you got to make an end run here and you got to go a different route here. And so it gets rather challenging to say the very least. So anyway, hope you had a fantastic weekend. Well, we are continuing our summary of what we have seen in the Olivet Discourse. Now, let me say this again because this is so incredibly critical. If we demonstrate that the Olivet Discourse in its entirety had to do with the end of the Old Covenant age in AD 70, this has or should have an absolutely profound impact on our overall understanding of eschatology. I mean, after all, the Olivet Discourse is Jesus's most lengthy discussion of the coming of the Son of Man. Therefore, we place the coming of the Son of Man within a given context, historical context, i.e., AD 70, then that must mean that we have to at least consider that if other passages, Revelation 14, for instance, that mentions the coming of the Son of Man, and it has other constituent elements that match the Olivet Discourse, okay, if we understand, if we come to realize that Revelation is talking about the coming of the Son of Man, and it's associated with the harvest, it is associated with the judgment, it's associated with the judgment of, quote, Babylon, the city where the Lord was crucified. And then we see that the Olivet Discourse, all about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, the coming of the Lord, the time of the harvest, the judgment on Jerusalem, then that ought to have a profound impact on our understanding of the book of Revelation, and therefore our understanding of eschatology. It is amazing to me that commentators like Kenneth Gentry have gone on record as saying, even if it could be demonstrated that the entirety of the Olivet Discourse was involving the fall of Jerusalem, the end of the age in AD 70, that would not materially impact our view of eschatology. Well, with all due respect to Dr. Gentry, that's nonsense. That is utter nonsense. And yet, you see, Kenneth Gentry is of the opinion that you have to divide the Olivet Discourse. And he keeps promising us, and look, I understand how this goes. This is not to impugn Dr. Gentry by any means, but he keeps assuring us he's got a book coming out that's going to definitively prove that the Olivet Discourse is a divided discourse. And he even promised us that he has found a fatal flaw in Don Preston's position. When I challenged him to go ahead and reveal that and to go ahead and blow me out of the water now, instead of making us wait over a year or whatever for his book, he said, no, I'll save that for later. Well, we're still waiting. Okay, so again, I just want to emphasize how important it is that we understand the critical importance of the Olivet Discourse for our understanding of eschatology. There is no dichotomy, there is no difference between what Jesus said in regard to his coming, in regard to the judgment, in regard to the kingdom, and the rest of the New Testament in regard to those issues. So once again, once you place Matthew 24:25 within the context of the first century, that must mean that you have to at least consider that these other passages are speaking of the same event. Now, I could go on and on about that, but see my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, in which I adduce well over 20 direct parallels between the Olivet Discourse, the entirety of it, not just one section of it, the direct parallels between the Olivet Discourse and Paul's Thessalonian epistles. Okay, just think about that. If the Olivet Discourse is AD 70 and it's directly parallel with 1 Thessalonians, what would that tell us about Thessalonians? That's powerful stuff. Okay, so this morning I want to summarize what we have seen in regard to Matthew chapter 24, verses 10 and following, 10 through 13. Jesus, in these passages, warned about a coming great apostasy. Many false prophets and teachers would arise and draw away many. Lawlessness would increase, and many would fall away. The love of many would grow cold, and it's literally the love of the many, and so the New American Standard Version translates it as the love of the majority. Now, my good friend Gerald Davis has suggested, I think it's at least worthwhile to consider, not convinced on it, I think there are some other elements on it, but my friend Gerald Davis suggests that maybe Jesus was talking about not an apostasy in the church and of believers, but an apostasy in Israel. In one way, it doesn't matter. In another way, it does. Okay? If Jesus is here predicting that there was going to be a great apostasy within Israel in the first century, well, certainly that's substantiated by Josephus in his history of the Jews, even in his wars of the Jews. And so that becomes a historical reality of the fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse in the first century. So there's not a problem with affirming that Jesus did say there was going to be an apostasy in Israel of the majority. Well, again, I'm not completely convinced of that, and I'm not completely convinced of that because of the parallel between Matthew chapter 24, 10 to 13, and Luke chapter 18. Now remember, in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is urging his apostles to beware, to beware of the difficult time that was coming, to beware of the false prophets. Now, remember again, he is warning his apostles about the coming of false teachers, urging them not to be deceived, urging them not to fall away, and saying that many would be led away by these false prophets. Well, again, that was true both of Israel, but it was also true of the church, of what happened in the church. Josephus records for us the arrival of many false prophets within Israel in the first century. Men who would be kings, so to speak, false prophets who arose. And so, once again, there's an applicability. We can certainly see that there were false prophets, but remember, and this is important, Jesus was warning his apostles not to be deceived by the coming of the false teachers, the false prophets, warning them not to fall away, warning them to be faithful unto death, to be faithful until the end, the day of the Lord. And so, on the other hand, you see, while we can certainly admit there was a great apostasy in Israel, that's what led to their destruction. There was, the keeping of the law fell on hard times. It was being abused. False prophets everywhere. But again, I'm not convinced that Jesus was talking about a great apostasy in Israel. Now, if he was, by the way, let me make this final observation on this particular point. He would have been following the Jewish narrative. The well-known Jewish narrative of eschatology was, in the last days, there would be an apostasy in Israel. But Elijah was supposed to come and address that apostasy. So there is that narrative that Jesus may have been following. However, this is the point that I want to make. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus taught his apostles they ought always to pray. Why? Well, because chapter 17, verse 25 and following, Jesus said he was going to be slain in that generation. And guess what that meant? He said, the days are coming in which you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man. Now, what does that mean? Pardon me. Well, some trying to argue against preterism says, well, what that means is that the apostles would desire to see the coming of the Lord. But they would not see it, therefore the coming of the Lord is off in the future. No, that's not the context. The context is persecution. If they hate me, they're going to hate you, Jesus said to his apostles in John chapter 14 to 16. So the context is the persecution, and he saw in chapter 18, he began to teach them that they ought always to pray, and he told the parable of what's known as the importunate widow. And he said there was in a city a judge who did not fear either God or man, and a widow woman came to him repeatedly saying, avenge me on my adversaries. And he would not do it. But she kept coming. And finally the judge says, this woman is wearing me out. And even though I do not fear either God or man, lest this woman wear me out with her continual coming, I will avenge her. And so Jesus posed the question, will not God avenge his elect who cry out to him day and night? Well, why are they crying out to him? Because they're being persecuted, just like their Lord was being persecuted. Again, chapter 17, verse 25. If they persecute me, they're going to persecute you. So Jesus said, will not God avenge his elect who cry out to him day and night? Yes, verily I say unto you, he will avenge them speedily. In other words, translated as speedily is in takai. And I developed this extensively, by the way, in my book, Who is This Babylon? In takai does never, ever, contrary to some former preterists who simply pervert the meaning of the Greek here, it doesn't mean rapidly as opposed to soon. Never does. And I've had people, with their PhD, no, Preston, it means swiftly, as in the nature of the action. It doesn't tell you when it was going to happen. But let me say again, with all due respect, that's utter nonsense. It's not the way intarkai is used in the New Testament. So here is Jesus making the promise that the martyrs were going to be vindicated speedily. Well, in Matthew chapter 23, he said the martyrs were going to be avenged in his generation. So intarkai is qualified and defined by this generation. But notice then what he said. Nevertheless, in spite of the fact that, yes, the martyrs are going to be vindicated speedily, when the Son of Man comes, and he'd already talked about the coming of the Son of Man in chapter 17, a time when, pray that your flight be not in winter, or if you're on the rooftops, don't go down, etc. Remember Lot's wife. Don't look back. Flee. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he even find faith on the earth? Now, very quickly here, one of the objections to covenant eschatology is often lodged and says, why don't we have a record? Why do all the patristics hold to a futurist view? Well, here's something that most people do not either grasp or they do not acknowledge. You see, ladies and gentlemen, here Jesus is saying, when the Son of Man comes, will he even find faith on the earth? Whose faith? He's not talking about Old Covenant Israel here. He is warning his apostles who are going to be persecuted. And just like in the parable of the sowing of the seed, in Mark chapter 2, a man went out to sow, and he sowed the seed. Some fell by the wayside, some fell on good soil, some fell on rocky soil, and as soon as the sun came up and the heat of the day came, they soon fell away. And he said, that's just like those who, when they hear the gospel, obey, but when persecution comes, they fall away. This is the kind of context of Luke chapter 18. He is warning, he is predicting apostasy of such a scale, an apostasy of believers in him of such a scale that he could say, when the Son of Man comes, will he even find faith on the earth, on the land? Folks, if we do not take into consideration the gravity, the scope of the, quote, Christian apostasy, unquote, in the first century and its impact for understanding for later generations, I don't think we're doing our due diligence. Okay? So what do we have in Matthew chapter 24, 10 to 13? We have Jesus predicting apostasy, perhaps apostasy in Israel, although, again, I'm not convinced of that. Everything that he had said up to that point was, do not be deceived. Don't let anyone deceive you. Don't let anybody lead you away, speaking to his apostles. But again, even if one granted that, that would still put us in a first century context for the fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse. But if we granted that it's an apostasy of the church in the first century, just think about what that means. It's astounding. And that aspect of the Olivet Discourse, in my estimation, is being greatly ignored. Okay? Thank you for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. Hey, don't forget, September special. Go to my website, donkpreston.com. Order the 2 books. There's a beautiful banner right up at the very top. Just click on it. With the free book that you're going to get, you're going to be saving over $10. Okay? Take advantage of it, and I'll see you on the flip side.